Hi, Captain Peter Cutsie with part 2 of the simulator assessment. We're now in the simulator, identical to the airplane. And if you've noticed, I've withdrawn the pilot seats so that we can see more of the instrumentation. When you get into the simulator, your instructor will get into the seat initially and have the group of pilots to be assessed watch him or her operate the seat. The movement of the seat forward and aft, up and down, armrests up and down, and seat belts. There are 5 altogether, including the shoulder harnesses. So your instructor or assessing officer, I should say, will brief you on that when you get into the simulator. What I'd like to do now is have a look at the control pedestal, the control column, and rudder pedals to start with. Let's bring the control column into view. Pilot flying, you will be in the right seat. So this is your station. This is the control column. We talked about it before. This is the checklist that I was talking about with all the checks. Here's a closer look at it. The different checks that you're going to be doing, similar to what you did before in your old operation, but all the checklists are here. Before takeoff checklist, after takeoff checklist, and descent, approach, and landing. So please use this checklist. It's on the other control column, also on the other side. This is the pilot seat. All right. The trim switches, the horizontal stab trim switches are here, and moving them down in spurts like so will trim the aircraft nose up. Moving them forward, the way you see me using them now, will trim the aircraft nose down. If you noticed, I trimmed in short bursts. I want to show you what happens on the flight deck. You'll hear a noise and this wheel will turn. This is connected to the horizontal stabilizer. So when you are trimming nose down or nose up, the horizontal stab trim wheel will rotate. Keep your legs clear. Thank you. Rudder pedal adjustment is made using this crank. It's just below the panel and adjacent to the rudder pedals themselves. And depending on your height and leg length, you will adjust these rudder pedals. So you crank one way to bring them forward, clockwise to bring them forward towards you, and counterclockwise to move them aft. So you adjust them to your stature. We're looking at the control pedestal. The speed brake lever is here. I, or your instructor, will look after arming that as far as the procedures are concerned for landing. And we won't use them in flight for this exercise that you're going to be doing. These are your thrust levers, forward thrust levers. These are your reverse levers. These are the toga switches that you heard me talk about, the takeoff go-around switches. Pushing either one when on the ground will actually allow both thrust levers to move to takeoff thrust, because we have the auto throttles armed for the initial thrust setting, and then your instructor will disengage the auto throttles once takeoff thrust is set. So that's where they are. And if you had to go around for any reason, you would depress those. All right. This is the flap lever. We currently have the flaps set to flaps 5, and we'll show you that on the instrument panel later when we move up. There are 2 dedents, one at flap 1 and one at flap 15, which requires moving the flap lever itself up through the dedent. And if you have trouble doing that, I will show you how to do it, or your instructor will show you how to do it. All right, so that's basically the control pedestal that you'll be concerned with. The stab has been set for takeoff at 5 1/4 degrees nose up. And if you notice, there's also a scale on your side as the pilot flying, and that's the first officer side. Let's get right into the primary flight display and the nav display. The primary flight display, that's on the pilot monitoring side. And this is on your side as a pilot flying. It's a duplication. The primary flight displays are on the outside and the nav displays are on the inside. And at the very center in between are the engine instruments. For takeoff, we'll only have a few of them visible, and that's normal for normal takeoff. The thrust settings that you're going to be using are here using the N1 references. Those are the references that we talked about in the first video. So when you're setting takeoff thrust, there is takeoff thrust. Pushing toga should actually do it for you, but you will follow through on the thrust levers until takeoff thrust is set. All right, let's go over to your panel. Primary flight display. The left-hand side, airspeed tape. 140 knots here is the set airspeed that we've set on the mode control panel for takeoff, which is V2 speed. On the right-hand side, the altitude tape, that is the barometric altimeter indication. And to the right of that, the vertical speed. And vertical speed up, vertical speed down. All right. In the center bottom part of the primary flight display is the radio altimeter, height above ground. So height above sea level, height above ground. Radio altimeter becomes alive at 2,500 feet when you're in flight, and that is a verbal call, radio altimeter alive. On the top of the primary flight display, we have called an FMA, flight monitoring annunciator. The left rectangle is the auto throttle. The center is the roll modes, and the right are the pitch modes. We'll be using this for takeoff, and as I mentioned, I will disconnect the auto throttles once takeoff thrust is set. The roll and pitch modes will be used for the ILS approach when we actually arm the approach. The little status annunciator here, it's called an ASA. It's a flight director and autopilot status indicator. Right now, the status of the autopilot flight director is flight director mode. If you have the autopilot engaged, that would be command. We're not going to be using the autopilot. Right now, we have an ILS frequency tuned, and I did it so that you could have a look at what will happen when you're in flight and you tune the ILS. You get the scale, lateral scale, localizer scale, and the glide path scale. The white line here represents the airplane, and the white line, vertical line here represents the airplane. We'll talk more about that later. At the bottom of the primary flight display is an arc, which is a compass rose. The magenta box you see here around the inverted triangle is the selected heading done on the mode control panel, and we'll talk about that when we go up to the mode control panel later. The inverted triangle is your actual heading, and the white line here is your track, which represents this white line here on your nav display. Here is where you would set your minimums, your barrel minimums. I've got the barrel minimum set for a Class C aircraft, which is a 737, for a Category 1 approach to runway 08 left. That won't be set when you get into the airplane, but you'll have to set it when you give your briefing, as you have done in your previous training and all your SOPs that you used before. Follow your previous company SOPs. We do not expect you to know anything about the 737. This briefing is to give you an opportunity and a chance to know a little more, or quite a bit more, before you come to the training center for your briefing with your assessor. All right, the ground speed is here. When you tune an ILS, and that's why I tuned it, you'll identify it up here in this left corner. So right now it's tuned to the ILS to runway 08 left at Muscat, IML, and there is a DME with it. And it says ILS, 084 is the track for the approach, and we are 0.2 nautical miles away from the glide path site. All right, we have an angle of attack indicator here, and you may or may not know what angle of attack is. Not really a concern for this assessment. If you know what angle of attack means, then you'll always be able to see it here. So the magenta represents what you've preset on the mode control panel: the heading, the airspeed, and the altitude. And we'll look at those later when we get up to the mode control panel. When you set your barometric Q and H for the reading for your altimeter, the indication is down here in hectopascals or in inches. We'll use hectopascals because that's what we use at Muscat. So that's it. Primary flight display. Why is it called the primary flight display? Because it's the most important instrument in the airplane. Your cross-check will always start here and branch off to other parts, but always end up here. This is what you'll be using throughout. Engine instruments, as we mentioned before, your thrust settings will be done with N1 on the thrust levers. That's it for this video. Just a brief introduction to the flight deck, and we'll get into another short video as part 3. Thanks for watching, and enjoy your assessment.